The sun hadn't fully cleared the tree line when Thomas Briggs pulled his '79 Ford into the gravel lot of Heartland Equipment on the edge of Colfax, Iowa. It was March of 1991. The ground was still half frozen, and the mud on his boots was the kind that never fully dries before planting season starts crowding your calendar. He was 43 years old. He'd been up since 5. He'd brought every document the loan officer told him to bring, organized in a manila folder he'd set on the passenger seat the night before, so he wouldn't forget it. The man behind the desk was named Roger Callahan. He'd run Heartland Equipment for 15 years and was known in Jasper County the way certain businessmen become known in small counties. Not because people liked him, but because they needed what he had. He sponsored the county fair. He had a good handshake. He wore a clean flannel on weekdays, which in that part of Iowa signals something specific about how a man sees himself. Thomas sat across from him and laid the folder open. He walked through it the way a man walks through something he's rehearsed. Not because he's nervous, but because he's been precise about it. He wanted a financing arrangement on a used 4.24, a machine with some hours on it, but nothing a good mechanic couldn't manage. He'd already had his neighbor look it over. He'd already calculated his projected yield against the payment schedule. He'd written the numbers down in 2 columns on a sheet of graph paper, and that sheet was in the folder. Callahan looked at the papers the way a man looks at something he's decided about before he sat down. He flipped 1 page. Then he closed the folder, and not roughly, just quietly, with a kind of finality that's worse than anger. He leaned back and said it plainly, the way people deliver verdicts in small towns, without raising their voice. Thomas, I'm going to be straight with you. Men who come in here carrying this kind of history don't turn it around. I'd be setting you up to fail, and I'm not in the business of doing that. He pushed the folder back across the desk. Thomas looked at it for a moment. He closed it. He put it under his arm, stood up, and shook Roger Callahan's hand, one firm pump, the way his father taught him, and walked out through the glass front door into the pale March light. He sat in his truck for a few minutes without starting it. Then he pulled out onto the county road and drove home. Before we move on, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. These stories reach people across more countries than I can count. And there's something about knowing you're out there that makes the work feel worthwhile. If anything on this channel has ever stayed with you after the screen went dark, think about subscribing, not to help an algorithm, just so the next story finds you when it's ready. To understand what came next, you have to understand what Thomas Briggs was actually standing on when he walked into that dealership. His father, Harold Briggs, had farmed the same ground outside of Colfax for 34 years. 220 acres of central Iowa ground, not the richest dirt in the state, but honest ground, the kind that rewards consistency. Harold had paid it off in pieces, selling grain at the right times, never overextending, keeping a paper ledger that he updated every Sunday evening after supper. He died in the winter of 1988 from a heart attack in the barn on a cold morning in January, which is how certain men in that part of the country seem to go, working until they can't. What Harold left behind was more complicated than it looked. There was a second mortgage nobody in the family had known about in full detail, taken out in 1982 during the farm crisis, when land values collapsed and operating loans got called in across the Midwest like dominoes. Harold had never fully talked about it. He'd been managing it quietly for years, making payments, holding things together. But when he died, the note became visible, and it was larger than the estate could absorb cleanly. Thomas's sister Margaret needed her share of the estate settled. She wasn't unreasonable about it, but she had her own family, her own needs, and she couldn't wait indefinitely. Thomas bought her out over 18 months by selling the northeast 40 acres to a neighbor. He hated doing it. That ground had some of the best drainage on the property, but it was the only way to keep the rest whole. He was left with 180 acres, a tractor line that was aging faster than his budget could address, a wife named Carol, and 2 kids still in school. He had some savings, not much, and a spring planting season bearing down on him like a freight train with no brakes. His main tractor, a 4020 he'd kept running through sheer stubbornness and a good parts relationship with a salvage yard in Newton, had started showing its age in the worst way. The transmission slipped under load. It had made it through the previous fall harvest, but just barely, and Thomas wasn't willing to bet a full corn crop on a machine that was telling him, clearly, that its good years were behind it. That's why he was in Roger Callahan's dealership. That's what was in the folder. Now he was driving home with the folder still under his arm and no plan B fully formed. There was a grain elevator meeting in Colfax that Thursday evening. Thomas went mostly because he needed to price corn futures and because standing still in his own kitchen felt worse than going. He sat near the back. He wasn't much in the mood to talk. A man named Victor Schaefer sat down next to him. Victor farmed about 280 acres over in Poweshiek County and had a reputation for being quiet and methodical and right about most things he said. They had met twice before at similar meetings and traded maybe 40 words total. Victor noticed Thomas's expression and didn't remark on it, which Thomas appreciated. After the meeting broke up, they ended up standing by their trucks in the gravel lot. Thomas told him briefly what had happened at Heartland Equipment. Not the emotional version, just the facts, the way you'd tell a story about a tractor that didn't start. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he mentioned a man named Eldon Park who farmed near What Cheer and had a 4430 sitting in a shed he wasn't using. Eldon had scaled back after his wife got sick. The machine had low hours for its age, and Eldon had been maintaining it out of habit more than necessity. Victor didn't know if Eldon wanted to sell or lease or make any arrangement at all, but he said it was worth a phone call. Thomas called Eldon Park the next morning. Let me tell you what happened next, because it didn't go the way Thomas hoped, not at first. Eldon was willing to talk, but he wasn't willing to sell. His wife had passed the previous autumn, and the equipment on his farm had become something he held on to, the way grieving men sometimes hold on to the objects that surrounded a life. He didn't need the tractor, but he wasn't ready to let it go. What he offered instead was a private lease, seasonal use, cash payment at the end of each harvest, no bank involved, just two men and a handwritten agreement. The rate Eldon named was not cheap. It was, in fact, higher per season than Thomas's financing payment would have been through Callahan's dealership. Thomas sat with that reality for about 2 days. He ran the numbers again. On paper, it didn't look smart. It added pressure to an operation that was already running lean. He signed Eldon's agreement anyway. The first spring was hard in the specific way that hard springs in central Iowa are hard. Not dramatic, just relentless. The lease payment on the tractor sat on top of the operating loan like a stone. Carol worked part-time at the school district. Thomas custom farmed 12 acres for an elderly neighbor named Hartley, who could no longer manage the work himself, charging just enough to make it worth the diesel. He planted soybeans on the south fields where the drainage was reliable, and corn on the heavier ground, and tried to spend nothing he didn't have to spend. He fixed his own equipment at night, under a work light in the equipment shed, with his older son Marcus sometimes handing him tools without being asked. There were evenings when the work ran past 11, and he was back up before 5, and the days blurred together into something that had no clean edges. Carol didn't complain. She understood the arithmetic of what they were doing. But there were nights at the kitchen table when the silence between them held the weight of everything they weren't saying. The first yield that fall came in better than Thomas had projected by about 8%. It wasn't a windfall. It didn't solve anything overnight. But it was measurable, real, and it meant the tractor lease payment cleared with enough margin left to cover the next operating loan without going back to zero. That was the small win. And in a year like that one, a small win is everything. Let me tell you about the year Thomas almost walked away from all of it, because that part of the story is the part that matters most. It was the summer of 1994, 3 years in. The soybean crop had gone in well, and then the July weather turned strange. Too dry for 3 weeks, then a fast, hard rain that came at the wrong angle and knocked down a portion of the corn on the west fields. The standing crop that survived was thin. Thomas did the preliminary yield estimates in early September, and the numbers were bad, not catastrophic, but bad enough that when he laid them out against his obligations, the lease, the operating note, a property tax, the cost of fuel and chemicals, there was a gap he couldn't arithmetic his way across. He stood in the west field on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the bent corn and said nothing. He came home and sat at the kitchen table, and Carol sat across from him, and they looked at the same numbers he'd been looking at alone. He thought about Roger Callahan's words. Not with anger, but with something worse than anger. He thought about whether Callahan had simply been right, whether the history he'd been given, the debt, the lost acreage, the aging equipment, the thin margins, was not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted as a verdict. There are moments in a man's life when the voice of the person who dismissed him starts to sound like reason rather than cruelty. This was one of those moments. He told Carol that night that he was considering approaching the bank about restructuring everything, possibly selling the home 40 and leasing the remaining ground to a neighbor while he found off-farm work. He said it quietly, without drama, the way you say something you've been turning over for a long time. Carol listened. She didn't argue. She asked him one question. Was the land still good ground? He said yes. She said then they should stay on it. That was the whole conversation. Thomas did not call the bank. He went to see Eldon Park instead. This is the part of the story most people would overlook, and it's the most important part. Eldon was 71 years old by then and had been farming central Iowa ground since before Thomas was born. He'd watched the 1970s expansion, the 1980s collapse, the land auctions where neighbors lost places their grandfathers had built. He'd survived all of it by doing something that looked from the outside like stubbornness, but was actually something more precise. Eldon didn't buy inputs on credit when cash wasn't available. He rotated crops on a longer cycle than most of his neighbors, which meant his yields in any given year were sometimes lower than the men farming beside him, but his soil didn't deplete at the same rate. He kept cash reserves in a separate account he called his ugly year fund. And he never, not once in 40 years, bought land when land prices were climbing hard. He only bought when something was distressed, and the seller needed liquidity faster than the market could provide it. Thomas already knew these things in outline. But sitting in Eldon's kitchen that September evening, listening to the older man talk through the '94 season, his own, not Thomas's, something clarified. Eldon had a bad year too. He wasn't panicking. He was reading it the way you read a variable in a long equation. One poor season in a pattern of sound decisions doesn't break the pattern. It tests whether the pattern was actually sound. Thomas drove home that night and did not call the bank. He found off farm work instead. Not as a retreat, but as a deliberate tool. He hired himself out to a grain elevator in Newton 3 days a week through the winter of 1994 and into early 1995. Every dollar from that work went into a separate account. He did not use it for living expenses. He used it to build the buffer Eldon had described. By spring of 1995, he had enough to plant without borrowing for inputs, which meant for the first time in 4 years, his operating exposure was clean. The years between 1995 and 2001 were not glamorous. They were not the kind of years that make stories. They were years of repetition, discipline, and restraint in a part of the country that values those things but doesn't make much ceremony over them. Thomas planted, he harvested. He paid his obligations ahead of schedule when he could, and on schedule when he couldn't. He maintained his equipment with a rigor that became almost philosophical. Not because he loved machines, but because he understood that a broken machine at the wrong moment is not a mechanical problem, it is a financial one. He bought back 12 acres from his neighbor Hartley in 1997, when Hartley's son decided not to farm, and the old man wanted the land in someone's hands who would work it. Thomas paid below market because Hartley trusted him, and because Thomas had been patient enough to be present when the right moment arrived. He didn't celebrate, he just went back to work. He watched other farmers around him make decisions he didn't make. He watched men buy additional ground at peak prices in the late 1990s, when optimism about commodity prices was running high. He watched men upgrade equipment before the old equipment was finished. He watched men expand their operations to a size that required everything to go right every year, which is a plan that depends on the weather and the markets both agreeing to cooperate simultaneously. Thomas didn't say anything about it. He wasn't the kind of man who commented on other people's choices. He just kept his own accounts in order, and his own ground productive, and his own obligations in a position where a single bad year couldn't collapse everything. Let me tell you what the early 2000s looked like in Jasper County, because the story only makes sense against that background. Corn and soybean prices had been under pressure for years. Land that had been bought at the top of the late 90s optimism was now anchoring operations with debt-to-asset ratios that left no room. When input costs began climbing and commodity prices didn't follow, the math started going wrong for a lot of people at the same time. Operating loans got harder to service. Equipment that had been financed aggressively became a liability. Banks that had been generous during the expansion started looking at portfolios differently. By 2002 and into 2003, there were farms in that county in trouble, real trouble. Not the slow, grinding kind that you manage your way through, but the kind where the bank is involved and the conversations get formal and the outcome is no longer entirely in the farmer's hands. Thomas watched it happen the way you watch something you saw coming from a long distance, without satisfaction, without judgment, but without surprise. Roger Callahan's dealership had expanded during the late 90s. Heartland Equipment had taken on a second location in Grinnell, added staff, upgraded the facility on the edge of Colfax. The expansion had been financed at a time when the financing felt conservative, because everything looked like it was going up. By 2003, the second location was bleeding. By 2004, the original location was carrying debt it couldn't service on its current volume, and the floor plan financing on new equipment inventory had become a liability on a balance sheet that needed revenue Callahan wasn't generating. The Grinnell location closed first. Then the conversations with the bank got serious about Colfax. The land the dealership sat on, 4.5 acres on the edge of town, with highway frontage and access, went to the bank in a distress arrangement in the spring of 2005. The bank listed it quietly. They weren't eager to advertise the situation. Distressed commercial property in a small Iowa county doesn't move fast, and they priced it to move. Thomas heard about it from Victor Schaefer, and the same man who'd pointed him toward Eldon Park's tractor 14 years earlier. Victor had heard it from someone at the bank, the way information moves in small counties. Not officially, but accurately. Thomas went and looked at the property on a Thursday afternoon. He walked the 4.5 acres. He looked at the building. He looked at the highway frontage. He looked at it the way Eldon Park had taught him to look at things, not with excitement, but with arithmetic. He made an offer the following Monday. It was a clean offer, cash-backed, with no contingencies, at a price slightly below the listing, because he could close fast and the bank wanted it off their books. The bank accepted within the week. He didn't make a production of it. He signed the closing documents in an office in Des Moines on a Tuesday in June of 2005. Mo shook the attorney's hand and drove home in the same manner he'd driven home from Roger Callahan's dealership 14 years earlier, quietly along the county road, back to the work that was waiting. The story reached Roger Callahan the way stories reach people in small towns. Not from Thomas directly, just through the ordinary transmission of information in a place where people know each other's business. Someone at the title company mentioned it to someone at the grain elevator, who mentioned it to someone who'd worked at Heartland Equipment for years. Callahan called Thomas about 3 weeks after the closing. Thomas answered. Callahan didn't have anything in particular to say. Nothing that could be said, really. He acknowledged what had happened. He said something about the property being in good hands. His voice had the quality of a man who has arrived at a reckoning he'd been avoiding for a while. Thomas thanked him for calling. He meant it. This is not a story about Roger Callahan being wrong and Thomas being right. That framing is too simple for what actually happened. Callahan looked at a folder of paperwork in 1991 and made an assessment based on what was in front of him. What he couldn't see, what the paperwork couldn't contain, was the specific combination of patience and knowledge and restraint that Thomas had either inherited or learned or built slowly in the years that followed. You cannot lend against those qualities. They don't appear in a credit profile. What Thomas understood, and what took him years of hard seasons to understand fully, is that farming at its core is a long game. Not long in the way people say long game meaning ambitious. Long in the way a river is long. It moves, it erodes, it deposits. It reshapes the ground around it over time, and the results are not visible in any single year or any single season. They accumulate. They compound. The discipline isn't glamorous. It doesn't make for good stories in real time. It looks, from the outside, like a man just doing the same careful things year after year, while the world moves faster around him. But that consistency is the thing itself. It is the method. And the method, given enough time, produces outcomes that look from a distance like luck. Thomas Briggs still farms that ground outside of Colfax. He's got a little over 240 acres now, including what he bought back and a few parcels he's added carefully over the years when the price and the moment aligned. His son Marcus manages most of the operation. Thomas spends more time than he used to just walking the fields in the evening, the way his father used to. Reading the ground the way you read something you've spent a lifetime learning to understand. The property on the edge of town, the 4.5 acres with the highway frontage, he leased back to a regional ag supply company the year after he bought it. The income from that lease has, every year since, covered his property taxes on the entire farm with money left over. He doesn't talk about it much. He's not the wealthiest farmer in Jasper County. He never set out to be. What he set out to do, in the months after he walked out of Roger Callahan's dealership with a rejected folder under his arm, was simply to stay on the land, to remain present on it long enough for the things he knew about it. The drainage patterns, the yield tendencies, the way the South fields respond to early planting, to translate into outcomes. That's the whole story. It's not complicated, but it is long, and the length is the point. You cannot compress it. You cannot rush the part where the years pass and the careful decisions accumulate, and the ground remembers the consistency with which it was tended. The door Roger Callahan closed in 1991 was not, as it turned out, the door Thomas needed. It was just the door that was in front of him at the time. What came after was harder and slower and more uncertain. And it produced something that a financing arrangement in a clean dealership office could never have produced. A man who understood, down to the marrow, exactly what he owned and exactly what it had cost him, and exactly why it was worth it. The frost was heavy on the east fields this morning. Thomas walked out before sunrise to look at it, the way he's done for 30 years, reading the temperature and the color of the ice on the cover crop, thinking about spring and what it will need from him. He walked back in before the light changed. There was work to do.